Welcome again to Beyond Galileo. This is a program that explores subjects and ideas surrounding the current exhibition at the University of Oklahoma's Fred Jones Museum of Art. The exhibit is titled Galileo's World, an Artful Observation of the Cosmos. A series of podcasts will be involved with this. Hope you're going to be listening to them all or have listened to them all. I am having artful discussions, conversations with experts in their fields here at the University of Oklahoma across our campus to find out how their discipline, even their personal opinions, but especially their disciplines, including art, science, philosophy, and of course many, many more, bridge Galileo's world into our own. My name is Gary Gress. I am in the Department of Geography and Environmental Sustainability. That is in the College of Atmospheric and Geographic Sciences. And I'm also on the Faculty Advisory Board here at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art. So we're here today with Mayor Cindy Rosenthal, now in her third 3-year term in Norman. Cindy is the director of the Carl Albert Center at the University of Oklahoma, where she is also a professor of political science. Mayor Rosenthal has been an advocate for the arts and culture here in Norman, earning her recognition as the 2010 Art Star, honored by the Oklahoma Alliance for Arts Education. Cindy, it's really a pleasure having you here today. So Cindy and I have known one another, like most of these folks that are here that I converse with, if you will. And I simply want to say that we started talking about generational things, which is maybe not good for some people, but I'll never forget the conversation that we originally had as far as relating to these exhibits and how they strike sort of a personal chord with you. And we'll sort of spin from there, if you don't mind, Cindy, but the personal connection with these exhibits. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, a couple things. Coming into the exhibit downstairs, I prompted my husband to the drawings in perspective, the first three-dimensional sense that you had with drawings reminded me of my 7th grade art class where we had the pinpoints on the horizon and we drew the building, and it was kind of an aha experience to sort of see that for the first time. But more importantly, sort of fast forward a few years, the pictures, the lithographs in particular on the Apollo story really struck home because, of course, would have been in 16, I think, at the time, and
you're dating yourself.
Yeah, I know. I shouldn't say that, but I do remember that whole. Well, I remember just growing up with all the space launches as even younger, but that story in particular, the Apollo story and the landing, and we were all having a party, as teenagers are wont to do, when the moon landing actually took place. And so that is a particularly vivid memory of the one small step. And there you have it, the footprint of Buzz Aldrin in the Lowell Nesbitt lithogram. So it resonated in a lot of different ways in terms of just youthful memories that were stirred.
Who would have ever thought that, here you are, as we all mature and go on in life, and here you're at an exhibit, and all of a sudden, I have many things down there in the exhibit that resonate with me, too. But that footprint, I know that was one of the first things you said, that footprint.
Right. Well, because it's one of those, generational experiences that we had, cultural experiences that we had. Of course, gathered around the television set and the radios to hear all this, but it was definitely one of those shared moments that stick with you, obviously, for a lifetime. And that picture brought it back.
All times are politically fascinating times, I think, and especially in the 60s and 70s, growing up. I guess what interests me is what led you into this professorship in this Carl Albert Center and political science and things of that nature, because all of this is mixed together, I think, in your life,
Well, That's a long story, and you don't want to hear it.
Well, you can make it short.
So, I think I've always been interested. I mean, I actually started off. I was going to be a journalist, and I was going to tell great stories and report on major events, and that was. And I started off as a newspaper reporter, but I soon learned that I really thought it would be more. I would have more impact if I were on the other side of the story, the doing side of the story. And so, my career has been really dedicated to working with elected officials and working on public policy issues, and then having the opportunity to do that myself. So it's there's a bumpy but natural transition that got me to where I'm at.
I know that might have been a little bit, shall we say, one of those off kind of questions, but I think it's all directly related to this exhibit, or indirectly at least. This intersection between, in that exhibit, between art and science and philosophy, and I'm going to add even political or politics and church at the time. It's all sort of interrelated, and that's maybe a good segue into this. How about your impressions and thoughts about that interface back then, and then even more curiously, how about now?
Well, one of the things that struck me, and again, I went through the exhibit with my husband, and we were having this conversation about how closely linked these disciplines seem to be during Galileo's time and the time of these artists, where art was in the employ of science and commerce, you creating maps for people to explore the world. And there seemed a much closer intersection. I think today we're a lot more specialized in some of our disciplines, so we often miss those connections, which really this exhibit, I think, provides a reminder of how important those are. But I think more often in our modern day life, we are so siloed, oftentimes talking to the folks who read our stuff and review our stuff, and we don't oftentimes get outside of those. I guess one of the things that's been really enjoyable about being in the public sector in a public leadership role is that it does give you opportunities to move among very different realms in a way that other people may never get the opportunity to. So, for instance, you mentioned I was acknowledged for my leadership role in arts in the state. Well, that's been an opportunity that's been provided to me by being in the public sector. Likewise, I know more about water than I ever would have known I would know about water, and I certainly don't know enough about the chemistry of it, and I really need to go back and take my high school chemistry class and probably a few college classes. But nonetheless, it's allowed me to sort of see those interconnections in a way that I think oftentimes our professional lives don't.
You mentioned maps and your fascination with some of the maps down there, and not just the celestial maps, although, I'd be happy to have you comment on any of your observations on those. But I know that you were impressed, fascinated, and me too, by the way, as far as the gores were concerned, that display that went linear down the wall and then actually into the next room or the next segment of the exhibit.
Right. Well, there are a couple things about the gores that I found fascinating. Again, the overlay of art over the science of the sky and the constellations, and how elaborate the depictions were. But I was also struck by the fact that there were 9 Southern Hemisphere gores and only 1 Northern Hemisphere gore, which I don't know if that was on purpose by the organizers, but certainly in terms of perspective, most of us who live in the northern half don't often see the world as our neighbors to the south would see it. And so those gores remind you of how the differences in the sky that are there. So that was a particularly fascinating part of the exhibit. But I was just as fascinated by the constellations that were drawn by Piccolomini, which didn't have the astrological figures, and they were just pencil and paper and precise measurement. But they had their own visual impact of what he was trying to map in the sky. And it's probably visually more like what we see when we go outside now, just a handful of stars as opposed to millions of stars. But that very simple portrayal of the sky, and then you move into the gores in contrast with that, and they're both seeing the same thing. What does the sky look like to us? And the contrast was really powerful. And again, this idea of perspective of what each one was looking at and trying to capture really was driven home by that contrast.
Yeah.
They're right next to each other, too, in the exhibit.
Yeah, I like the way that's set up myself, and that idea of the melding of math, and throughout this entire exhibit, math and science and arts and the arts, if you will. Yeah, it's a good exhibit as far as resonating all that too. I know. I'm just thinking here, growing up as a kid, we always look up the stars and we always wonder, and
well, we don't see.
How did you do as a kid on that?
We don't see all those stars that even what we might have seen as we were kids because of light pollution, and which is a huge loss to people who live in urban areas now. And increasingly that's a big problem, even in a relatively modest-sized city like Norman, Oklahoma. But the other constellation piece that's in the exhibit by John Flansteed from the Greenwich Observatory also struck me, because it wasn't ornate like the gores with the fantastic and imaginative creatures, but they show the different constellations. But that reminded me just of how little of that sky on a day-to-day basis that we see in our modern day lives, and how much we're missing when we go to look at what's outside.
I know. I'm thinking back to my first impressions of as a kid, the moon and the stars and all that. You're helping me reminisce a little bit here too.
Sound like a couple old reminiscers
here.
Yeah,
we are. Parts of the exhibit that connect with your current role. I gotta ask this question. I know you were thinking about this too, as far as your role as mayor. And so then I've got a couple more, but I'm curious as to that connection.
Well, again, the Flansteed is the one that really hit me. Again, the contrast between these different portrayals of the constellations, but that one is the sky is so full of stars. And we had one of our knockdown, drag out political battles at City Council over a commercial lighting ordinance to try to get our commercial developments to contain light, direct light, so that you wouldn't have the enormous amount of light pollution that we have all over the country, really. But there are a lot of cities that have done what are called night sky ordinances, and we weren't considering anything nearly as rigorous or restrictive as a night sky ordinance, but just trying to reduce glare, direct light more effectively, reduce some of the light pollution. And, it was considered anti-democratic, anti-business, anti-development. Unfortunately, what we lose when we don't pay attention to some things like this are those experiences of seeing the sky so full of stars.
Any observations on, as you go toward the end of the exhibit, and I'm sort of blindsiding you on this one, as far as women in astronomy, any kind of observations on any of that? Or did you have time to walk the entire exhibit? Like I say, I'm sort of catching you off guard here,
I think you're talking about the Catherine Whitwell.
Yeah.
And
you passed the quiz.
It was towards the end of our stay, but it's probably something I'd want to go back to. I was fascinated with the fact that she's an educator and an economist, I think, and that the book that she writes with the engraved plates was a dialectic or a dialogue between her and her daughter. And having a daughter, was pretty fascinated just about the concept that inspired that piece of work. How do I get to look at all the pictures in that book and not just the one that's on display?
I know. It's you're right. It's going to inspire, I hope, other people, digging into this stuff even more. Pretty fascinating stuff. Any other general observations on anything in the exhibit, or any other thoughts that you might have that, the general folk out there might be interested in, or your guidance and advice on this exhibit of sorts?
I'm not a good guide. In the future, maybe I will be a better guide. But I guess I would say, because you talked about and you haven't really asked me about the political science discipline, but certainly
that was my last question. But now that you're there,
I'm
go
already
for it.
there.
No.
Okay.
It's really not the last question, but it was one of them. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think certainly Galileo's ideas upended the world, challenged political leadership. And again, it's one of those points of intersection that, while I don't really think the exhibit addresses it front on, the politics part of his contributions, certainly we know it's true that art, science, and politics, and then add in religion, can provoke some of our most heated conversations around the dinner table. And I think that's a good thing at the end of the day, though I've walked away from the dinner table several times in arguments with my brothers, but I think that at the end of the day, that out of that rough and tumble debate and discussion, we learn so much about ourselves, about the world around us. And so that's, I think, a major contribution of a legacy of Galileo's.
Maybe more, I don't know, would you think there would be more of a combination or melding, if you will, of church and politics, if you will, of the day, more than there might be today? I don't. And then there's this thing about helios
in Galileo's time.
Yeah, and heliocentric and geocentric. I mean,
I don't know. We get an awful lot of disruption at the intersection of science, religion, and politics today.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure we can compare. Certainly, his ideas cause people to fundamentally change their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. But as I think about some of the public policy challenges ahead, like climate variability, we know that is going to cause us to also fundamentally change and rethink our place in the world, our ability to control our environment, and what life will look like in the future. So, who knows? Many years from now, somebody's going to be doing a podcast about those turbulent times in the second decade of the 21st century.
Yeah. The idea of change and the idea of how things do change, and all those philosophies and everything that's wrapped up in any of that.
And it's disruptive to politics. Those kinds of challenging points of view, those challenges to
Sure.
the existing order that cause lots of turmoil in our politics. And I think that's what we're seeing right today.
You have been listening on this podcast to Mayor Cindy Rosenthal, also director, if you will, of the Carl Albert Center. Some of her reflections on what the exhibit is about and Galileo. And I do want to thank you today, Cindy, for being with us. And like I always tell people, to be continued. So be listening to these podcasts, and thank you again.